Pete, I got to go to you first. It was your reporting in January that said Rosenstein was going to stay until Mueller's work was done. Does that still stand? And does quasi-announcing his departure mean the report's coming soon?
I would put it this way, Stephanie. I would say that this is just one of many signs that we believe the Mueller report is about to be submitted to the Justice Department. I would say it's probably going to go up there possibly this week, maybe next week, that soon. So you're right. The only news here about Rosenstein is precisely when, because he did say in January he would leave shortly after William Barr came in. Now, remember, the timing here is not entirely up to Rod Rosenstein. It's also a lot up to William Barr. They've obviously now had this conversation. And actually, Rosenstein is going to stay a little longer than we initially thought he would. So I think it's quite likely that he'll be there when the report is turned over. He may have some voice in advising Mr. Barr, the new Attorney General, on how to handle it, what to turn over to Congress, what to make public, how to do so. But it does now appear that, yes, this is just, again, our speculation, putting all the pieces together, because the special counsel's office is singularly uncommunicative about these things. That's the way they've been all along. But we think, yes, the scenario that you sketched out is accurate, that he'll be there when the report is turned over.
All right, Shannon, this comes as Rosenstein has been caught up in these allegations from Andrew McCabe about efforts to investigate President Trump. Earlier this morning, he was on Today's Show with Savannah Guthrie talking a bit more about that. Let's take a listen.
Did you order a counterintelligence investigation into the president?
I did. It is saying that we had information that led us to believe that there might be a threat to national security. In this case, that the president himself might, in fact, be a threat to the United States national security.
When you're opening this particular kind of investigation, counterintelligence, did you suspect the president might actually be working for Russia?
We thought that might be possible, yes.
All right, so that's McCabe's assertion. And now President Trump has been holding on to this idea that all of it was an illegal and treasonous attempt to overturn the 2016 election. Shannon, what should people make of this?
So the interesting thing about that is that we don't know what happened after McCabe opened this counterintelligence investigation. So did that carry on after Mueller was appointed? Because shortly after McCabe opened this investigation, Mueller came in and sort of took over the whole show. So did Mueller continue that? Because the impression of the White House and the president's lawyers all this time has been, yes, there was an obstruction of justice investigation, but that the other part of the investigation was into the campaign and the 2016 election and Russian interference in the election. There's never been talk about them concerned that the president was being investigated as to whether or not he was acting on behalf of a foreign power. So really the assumption all this time from the White House and the president's legal team has been that the president, as they keep saying over and over again, hasn't been a target, hasn't been a subject of this investigation. And they feel like they've gotten indications from Mueller's team that that hasn't been the case. So the big question I have is what happened after McCabe opened that counterintelligence investigation? Was it shut down right away, or has it quietly been going on behind the scenes all this time, which we just don't know yet?
That is an excellent question. I also want to share, McCabe talked about Congress and what they knew. Take a look at this.
The purpose of the briefing was to let our congressional leadership know exactly what we'd been doing. Opening a case of this nature, not something that an FBI director, not something that an acting FBI director would do by yourself, right? This was a recommendation that came to me from my team. I reviewed it with our lawyers. I discussed it at length with the Deputy Attorney General, and I told Congress what we had done.
Did anyone object?
That's the important part here, Savannah. No one objected. Not on legal grounds, not on constitutional grounds, and not based on the facts.
Wow. So he's talking about briefing the Gang of Eight. Doug, if Congress knew about this and did not push back, what does it tell you?
Well, it's interesting because it goes to the interplay between.
It's interesting.
Thank you. It goes between the interplay criminal investigation, counterintelligence investigation, and congressional oversight. They're three different categories, okay? But to your question, and I agree with you, you can say they really should have taken a more active role in Congress in this. But again, the comebacker is always going to be, wait a minute, there was already an intelligence investigation and a criminal investigation underway, and that's why we didn't, would be the explanation. But I agree with you, essentially, Stephanie.
Do you believe all these allegations that we've seen impact Rosenstein's credibility and by extension, the way people in general feel about the Mueller investigation?
I think it does, to some extent. I mean, working back to what Pete was laying out, I mean, the point is when you have a new attorney general, they're going to bring in a new deputy attorney general. So that's kind of interesting. We're saying, oh, he's leaving, but the point is he'd be leaving anyway. So it's only a question of timing. But I think there are questions, obviously, about what went on here. I don't jump to, either side of the political conclusions. But the reality is the circumstances under which the Mueller probe was started is something that's being discussed vigorously, intensely. People are angry back and forth, two different sides. One is, yes, there were legitimate concerns about the president. And then the other side is, no, it's a deep state witch hunt. I come right down the middle of those two, honestly, myself.
Well, we'll soon find out. Ken, you wrote just a few days ago that people might be disappointed in the Mueller report. Does that exactly prove Doug's point that people are so divided and they are hanging on the extreme rafters that there's no home for an answer in the middle?
Actually, that headline referenced the fact that people may not see the Mueller report, Stephanie. That's why they're going to be disappointed. They won't see it. There's a widespread misapprehension that this is going to be like when Ken Starr released his report on Bill Clinton to the public and to Congress on the same day. That is not going to happen. The rules that Robert Mueller is operating under require that he submit a confidential report to the Attorney General. And that report will contain grand jury information, classified information. So there's no way the Attorney General can just make the whole thing public. And in fact, William Barr, in his confirmation hearing, was very cagey about exactly how he will proceed. That said, I do think there is a widespread demand. Obviously, the public demands answers to these big questions that we've been discussing, mainly whatever happened to that counterintelligence investigation? What evidence did the FBI find? Is Donald Trump compromised? And is there a prosecutable case for obstruction of justice, even though the president can't be indicted? The public will demand answers to that. It remains to be seen, though, how the Attorney General will transmit those answers and explain what Robert Mueller found.
Pete, what happens to acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker once Barr takes over?
Well, that has already happened. He goes back into private life. Actually, I think he's going to stay at the Justice Department in some other role. So he'll remain for a time at the Justice Department. But of course, he's no longer in the command structure there. That stopped last Thursday when William Barr was sworn in.
Shannon, what are people in the White House saying about Rosenstein leaving and Barr taking over? Does it change the level of concern they have about the Mueller investigation? Because I have to tell you, when I speak to people inside the White House, they honestly act like they don't have a care in the world, and it blows my mind.
Well, there's a lot of people in the White House who are just battle tested at this point, and nothing shakes them. They've been under this sort of pressure of this investigation and every sort of drama of the day for 2 years now. So, yeah, I mean, you get a lot of shrugs at this point. But as far as Barr coming in, there are a lot of people who are happy that the president is going to have an attorney general, at least for a period that he is comfortable with, that he likes, until I'm sure there will be some sort of falling out at some point, like there is between the president and almost every cabinet member. But initially, they will have an attorney general who the president has a good rapport with. And then it's just really sort of bracing for what comes next. They've sort of designated someone within the White House counsel's office to handle the communication. The president's legal team has been working on a counter report. And I've also been told that the White House definitely plans is going to be made public for Mueller's report to scrub out anything that they say falls under executive privilege. So that would be any conversations that happened when the president was in the White House, like between the White House counsel or between his aides. So another, to Ken's point, way people could be disappointed, where the White House could push back and say that they want information kept from the public because it falls under executive privilege.
Well, people should be excited if we just get to the truth, whatever it is.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.